Hello everyone and welcome to the Backbench. This is the launch of Season 3 for the first time in front of a live audience here in Tviot in the dining room. Today, I am joined by our new co-host of the season, Quinn Farr. Thank you.
Hello.
And we're also joined by a special guest, the much beloved professor, Patrick Theiner.
That was not what I thought would come, but sure, I'll take that. Thank you.
That's what's here. So today we're going to talk about the theory behind the headlines. And as Patrick is at the moment teaching many of us political theory, we thought who else would be appropriate than yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's also a great excuse for me to just talk out of my ass for 45 minutes, so it's...
Exactly. So I think the first topic to start off with would be no better than COP26, as that starts in a couple days, and we're going to watch Edinburgh and Glasgow both go to standstills, which will be entertaining for the students who can't show up to class. But what is your take on, we'll start with that. What's your take on this? Is this internationalism at its finest? Is it going to work?
Okay, what's my take on COP26? It's cool, so it's good that it happens. Exactly, you're right. I mean, we all like when the world comes together, and I think we read the numbers, right? 25,000 delegates descending on Glasgow. So, I mean, I think what's interesting about it is that, to me, these kind of big international conferences always feel a bit like kind of a tool fallen out of time. Like the whole idea, of half the world needs to come to one city and then negotiate something that then has ramifications for the rest of the world is a little funny, right? I mean, we've done 2 years of everything online, so why the hell do we now need to go all to Glasgow and negotiate that? But I mean, it is that tradition of like international conference diplomacy, which I love, and I always thought like if I didn't do this kind of stuff, I would become a diplomat and I would be there and draft things. I'm sure we have people listening or maybe people here that do, model UN stuff. Anyone who's pretended to be a diplomat before or wants to pretend to be a diplomat would be fascinated by this kind of thing. I think there's something special about this amount of people coming together to try to find solutions. Problem is just if what comes out tends to be a bit of a wet fart, then the disappointment afterwards is only stronger.
I suppose your issue is that I think the main world leaders, so the likes of Biden, EU leaders, are only there for I think the first 2-3 days. So what can you really get accomplished in 2-3 days?
I mean, that's a really good question, right? Because I think it gets to the heart of what this kind of conference diplomacy actually does, right? Or what it can do. I mean, the whole idea of, so first off, obviously at this point, everyone knows what COP26 is designed to do, right? It's the conference of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, right? Which is the successor to the Kyoto Protocol. So the idea is really to have everyone at the table and negotiate global standards for this kind of thing. And part of that, there's always a component to these kind of things where you have the broad guidelines and the broad sort of painting the picture of what's supposed to happen. And then you have the kind of small scale stuff, the details that have to be hammered out. I read just the other day, and I'd forgotten about this, that in the Paris Climate Conference in 2015, 2015? Yes, thank you. Occasionally I might look to the audience like, please fact check me if I say a date or so. So at the Paris Climate Conference was almost derailed at the last second because of one word in the specific wording of the outcome document that was supposed to say should, but actually said shall, okay? So that's the kind of details, and it was about, targets. How should targets be achieved or shall they be achieved, right? Which has a different connotation. So what I'm trying to say is the first 2 to 3 days kind of demonstrate that global commitment, like, yes, we want to achieve something, and then is when the actual work starts, when all the little diplomats kind of hole up in their corridors and in their hotel rooms and try to hammer out the actual details of the statement, which I always find fascinating, but it's a bit, the look behind no, that's a German expression, the look behind the facade of the sausage factory, I guess how sausage is made, that's what I was trying to, which I always find really interesting in these conferences, and which isn't really talked about all that much. So I personally think, fine, let them come in there, have their photo shoot basically, say like, yay climate, and then ship them out, because they're obviously not the ones that are going to generate the document that is then signed off by the countries.
I think like what you're saying is interesting in the sense that the contours in a lot of these summits come to light sort of afterwards. And I think for a lot of people who sort of have a baseline knowledge but maybe aren't like super diplomacy nerds, come from the approach of like, oh, what happens at these conferences is going to be binding afterwards. Like, it's what you're saying about should and shall. They're just going to do all of this. They're going to fix it all. But I think what we're seeing even with like Biden, for example, in sort of the breakdown nationally that's happening in terms of like climate policy and the Build Back Better agenda is that it's all sort of falling to bits. So he's sort of going to this conference to say, you know, climate change, let's work on environmental issues, but at the same time, you sort of walk away going, you know, like, now what? You know, what are you actually going to do? Can you even reconcile it with no national sort of backing?
And then you have who's going to become president in 4 years and just back out of the deal.
And
It's
that's
not even
terrifying.
4 years. It's not even 4 years. We don't have that much left at this point. So, I mean, the yes, I mean, I think it's a good observation, right? I mean, the basic fact remains that anything at the international level that doesn't have sanctioning mechanisms built in might as well not exist, or we might as well call that voluntary. It doesn't matter if on the box it says binding or non-binding. If there's no sanctioning mechanisms included, which of course isn't in these kind of climate agreements, then yeah, I mean, it's essentially just everyone going pinky promise, and then we hope from there on out. I mean, that's how it's worked for a long time, right? Yeah. I mean, back in the days of the Kyoto Protocol, there was a form of sanctioning mechanisms integrated in that the Kyoto Protocol did something really smart. It introduced this idea of emissions trading. So the idea that, yes, you can lower your pollutions, but you can also pay someone else to pollute less, and then you can put that on your bank balance, which is genius and also a bit fucked up. Sorry, can we swear on this podcast? Is that...
We'll clap it out.
Wonderful. Okay, perfect. Because that's difficult for me. So the emissions trading scheme is such a smart mechanism because it's a market mechanism, right? So it gives market incentives to states for doing this. And so if you didn't stick to your commitments, you were denied access to the emissions trading mechanism, which is cool. And unfortunately, everyone afterwards decided that, oh, no, that's a bit much in terms of consequences. We can't have that anymore. So that mechanism is, not the emissions trading mechanism is gone, but the sanctioning mechanism is no longer there. So yeah, if it doesn't have any sanctions, then it might as well, it doesn't matter if it says binding and non-binding.
Very much a realist observation.
Yeah.
You're like,
Oh yeah,
if
please.
you can't force me to, I won't
yeah,
do it.
Absolutely. I mean, whoever has smaller siblings knows that realism is onto something, okay? I think inner family dynamics, I think, is a very good picture for international politics.
Really though.
I think, like, looking at the theory, obviously COP26 is very much liberal institutionalism. And I wanted to ask, is liberal institutionalism, this is my tutorial just replaying, is it alive anymore? China and Russia aren't coming to the G20, which takes place tomorrow. The leaders, obviously Putin, Xi Jinping, are not going to go to COP26. They're going to send their delegates. Is the world wanting to cooperate anymore?
Wow. Okay, so good question. Good observation, obviously. Now, we talked about this just before the start, and we realized that Xi Jinping actually hasn't been outside of China in 22 months or something. Yeah, January 2020. So it wouldn't be that surprising that it doesn't turn up. I think it's not dead for two reasons. A, states are still willing to spend money on it. This kind of stuff is a huge expense of resources. Right. So if everyone was more or less agreed that this was a waste of time, they wouldn't do it. States have stopped doing other things if they felt they were a waste of time. They haven't done it so far. The second, I think, and slightly more cynical indicator of the importance is how much countries hate it when they're not integrated into these. So it's still, I mean, you know, a country like Russia, right, was kicked out of the G8, right? And purely by the amount of hate that came from the Russian side about this as a measure, I think that indicates that the states all want to be at the table. Whether that generates much is sadly an entirely different question, but I think states at least still believe that there's a value in it. I mean, the same goes for, you know, a big international organization like the UN, right? I mean, the UN has a fairly big budget each year, although its budget is less than what the UK collects in corporate tax, right? And it's also less than what the UK spends on its NHS. So overall, the UN doesn't cost that much, but still, it's a couple of billions. You could spend those billions elsewhere. So I think that the fact that states are still willing to put resources towards it, and that they really dislike when they're being excluded from the club, I think still, to me, indicates that they still like that as a thing. Now, I expertly skirted your question maybe about whether it really still does something, but at the very least, states think that it does something.
No, but I think the absence of sort of segueing into chatting about the G20, the absence of Russia and China from that. They have parties who are there.
Yes,
who are,
physical
your
absence.
Little diplomats who are skittering back and forth. But in terms of the symbolic nature of having leaders there, a lot of people have sort of said this is sort of the moment for the United States to sort of get its act together with everyone else, especially in the post-Trump era, where it sort of felt that the Western, quote unquote Western, being sort of, I don't even know, not a PC term anymore, I don't know, but in terms of France, Germany, Canada, the United Kingdom, it sort of felt during the Trump administration that was all sort of turned on its head a bit. And I actually was reading this really insightful piece about it, in that I think that someone was noting that Donald Trump liked to impress dictators as opposed to be friends with other world leaders, and have the bromance with people like Emmanuel Macron or Justin Trudeau. But in terms of Joe Biden now being at the G20, it's sort of his opportunity to sort of get back there. America's back. What does that even mean, quote unquote?
Yeah.
But
I suppose when Biden goes and speaks in Brussels, he doesn't have world leaders laughing behind his back.
yeah.
No, I mean, you would hope so. You would hope so, right? On the other hand, I mean, the problem that the US currently has is that we all read newspapers.
Yeah.
And we know what's going on in the US. So it's no secret anymore, of course, that for Biden, passing anything domestically is extremely hard, right? Now, funnily enough, that can actually go, coming political theory, I'm trying to integrate something here. Is that the cameras?
Oh, no, that's just one.
Okay. So I think what's interesting about this is that obviously when you don't have strong majorities at home, that can weaken you abroad. Because everyone knows Biden's going to turn up, shake hands, go home, and then one guy from West Virginia blocks everything that could go through domestic legislation. That doesn't strengthen his negotiation position. But it's also paradoxically sometimes in the past strengthened negotiators, because they could more credibly say, I can't agree to this because I can't pass this domestically, right? So I would love to agree to this, but there's this thing called Congress, and so I can't do that. So in certain situations, it can make your life easier when you're negotiating these things, because you have that, you can always point to that veto player back home. But of course, overall, it doesn't necessarily increase your standing on the world stage if everyone knows that you can't get stuff passed.
No, but segueing into talking about sort of, okay, maybe Biden in terms of environmental policy and sort of to perhaps realist these sort of airy-fairy issues of whatever.
Yeah.
But in terms of the absence of China, in terms of the symbolic nature of having President Xi at the conference, in terms of Biden having the opportunity, I think, to reframe the narrative about what's currently happening in Taiwan, especially because as we see the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, turning away from the Middle East, turning to East Asia now, I find it bizarre in the sense that I think that everyone talks about Biden and the Democratic Party now in these non-interventionalist terms, because to a lot of Democrats, they saw the withdrawal from Afghanistan as a good thing. But I think now turning to Taiwan, where he made that recent statement in the town hall where if something, hypothetically, if something were to happen, I can't say, but maybe we would, it's sort of bringing in this question of, does the U.S. really want to stay out of stuff, or does the U.S. just, not want to be in Afghanistan anymore, but turn their, liberal realism elsewhere.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there was like 5 national security advisors sweating bullets in that at that time at that town hall when he made that comment. I mean, yeah. I mean, can the U.S. afford to stay out of things? I mean, at the moment, it seems that the political climate has shifted somewhat, right? I mean, the U.S. has always seen sort of ups and downs in how interventionist it was around the world. And we do seem to see that we're now sort of on a downswing in terms of the willingness to be involved elsewhere. So, or at least the willingness to be involved somewhere where there's no real clear benefits to be gained at the domestic level from staying, but where there's very clear benefits to be gained from leaving or from not getting involved, right? I mean, the story of U.S. foreign policy is always a story of U.S. domestic policy, right? Has always been that. I mean, it's kind of the case in every country, but still. So, I mean, the thing with Taiwan, I think, is so interesting because it's a situation that I think if I had to put 100 pounds down on what's going to happen with that, I don't think I would take any bets in any direction because it's such an. I mean, technically, it's not unpredictable, right? But it feels volatile, right? I don't think it's necessarily unpredictable because we know where the players are and what they want and how strong they are. If we think about, realists would think about this in, the kind of risk Game of Thronesy kind of way, right? So we know where the players are, we know what their capabilities are, and we roughly know what they want. Now the question is just, can that come to a point where the US would have to do something? God, I think it's unlikely from both sides. I don't think there's. I mean, now China would have quite significant, would have something to gain domestically from regaining Taiwan, right? It's been a foreign policy goal for decades at this point, right? But then on the other hand, all of these things come with a risk attached, right? And the risk-reward benefit for Taiwan is much, much more in the balance than it is to continue what China has done so far, which is to more or less boss around the rest of sort of Eastern and Southeast Asia, and Central Asia, of course, right, through the Belt and Road Initiative. So they've found, I think, other ways to increase their standing and throw their weight around. And I think the gamble with Taiwan is too risky. And the current Chinese leadership are not risk takers in the classic sense. They want to assert themselves, right? They want to have proper weight on the world stage. And I mean, hell, with 1.2 billion people, why wouldn't they, right? And with an economy like that, but they're not predisposed to taking huge risks in foreign policy. Have never been. So that's why I think the fingers crossed, okay? Yeah.
Until we all get drafted into a third world war.
And I have something to teach about for 20 years. We win either way, so.
What are the triggers? It's the Franz Ferdinand 3.0,
Oh God, so many lectures in there, so many lectures.
I kind of want to look up, because the America interjecting Taiwan brings up kind of authoritarian hypocrisy in a way. So the Taiwanese president the other day said quite liked, which was when authoritarian regimes demonstrate expansionist tendencies, democratic countries should come together to stand against that. Taiwan is on the front lines. Biden backed that. He's the first president, I think, since the founding of independent Taiwan to actually say, we'll back you. But at the same time, America says that, they see China as a legitimate player. Obviously, right now, we talked about before how President Xi is trying to consolidate power. There's no democratic liberal election. There's an article in front of us from The Economist which says that the Kremlin obviously falsified about 14 million votes to keep Putin in power. They hang out with them. And then you have Saudi Arabia, the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who in all intensive purposes is not a nice guy.
Good Bond villain, yeah. Would make a good Bond villain.
So you kind of have the point of, is America kind of hypocritical to get involved with Taiwan, while at the same time working with all these other organizations?
Yes. But so is everyone else.
And what about it?
Yes. Exactly. So that's the question, right? I mean, we've had now a century plus basically where democracies had to in some way either work with non-democracies or tried to influence them, right, towards democratizing, but I don't think that's a U.S. specialty, right? Now, the U.S. might be the most, I mean, just because of their profile on the world stage, they're the most scrutinized, right? But I mean, countries like Sweden and Germany are also happy, for example, to sell arms to Saudi Arabia without really batting an eyelid over their authoritarian tendencies. I mean, I think the hypocrisy that it unmasks is that human rights concerns are checked by security and economic interests, right? Now, that's not a surprise to any of us. The question is, can you do something about that, right? Because, I mean, most of the ways so first off, like any country that's a veto power or a nuclear power, you might as well just forget about it. You cannot exert pressure on these countries like you could on others. Now, that's not the case for Saudi Arabia, right? Saudi Arabia is not a nuclear power and it's not a veto power. It's just another country for all intents and purposes. Exactly, they can cut your oil, but that also means, I mean, to make money, they have to sell the oil, right? So there you have a reciprocal relationship that you might be able to exploit. And I think there's more power in exploiting these these bilateral relationships with lesser countries, so to say, that we might be able to influence. If I can, I think I can pop COP26 back in there, because I think one of the outcomes that I would love to see from this conference is a carbon tax on goods. And this is something that's been proposed before, right? It's not a new proposal. And the idea would be that you tax products based on their carbon footprint. So there would be an additional carbon tax. And if you got, the EU or the rest of the Western world together, that's such a significant market slice that would then, through sheer market incentives, also force other countries such as China, to adjust their productions, for example, because otherwise they would feel that financially. And I think making it hurt financially is almost always a more surefire way to enact change on the international level than almost any other form of pressure.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes into what we were saying about how the chances of a war between China and Taiwan and America involved is so slim, because now it's all about sanctions. War is kind of, anyone could argue war is kind of dead. Yeah. World War, in any way, is kind of gone. It was kind of a very 20th century phenomena. Yeah. But
I mean, if I may, the one risk that we still have is errors and miscalculations, right? So I'm a huge fan of the Cuban Missile Crisis. If anyone has done anything, fan. Okay, I should rephrase that. I should really rephrase that. Phrasing, Patrick, phrasing. Okay, I like thinking about the Cuban Missile Crisis because it is, in a sense, it's not identical to the situation in Taiwan, but it's also a situation where you had two nuclear-armed superpowers that had basically a conflict over a third territory. In the Cuban Missile Crisis was Cuba, here it would be Taiwan, right? And so what was interesting there was that the Cuban Missile Crisis, go on a Wikipedia tangent on this, by the way, you won't regret it. Super interesting phase in history. And what's so interesting about the Cuban Missile Crisis is that it had along the way like 5 or 10 instances where things could have escalated purely based on someone being an idiot. Almost said the wrong word here. Someone being an idiot, right? So, things like, a U.S. plane accidentally flies from Alaska into Russian airspace, and that makes the Russian, on the day that they're also discussing what should we do with Cuba. Or there's like there was a Russian submarine down there that couldn't phone home to Moscow and then got accidentally hit by a depth charge from a ship that didn't even know that the submarine was there. So, what I'm trying to say is, even a situation that looks tense but stable always has a risk of escalation through sheer tomfoolery. I haven't said that word in a long time. So yeah, there's always errors. There is always a chance of errors and miscalculations.
And that submarine crisis caused the creation of one of my favorite movies, Crimson Tide. So it wasn't a bad thing, Denzel Washington. But
Dear God.
you know,
In terms of also talking about miscalculations, I think that ties interestingly to Afghanistan because I mean miscalculation, that really was, kind of a messed up situation. So like in terms of the volatility and a reflection perhaps on Biden and Biden's foreign policy advisors, military advisors, the situation in Afghanistan, you're kind of, while we're sitting here, we're saying probably not in Taiwan, probably not. At the same time, you're kind of like, but they kind of really miscalculated that. They really didn't see that coming. I mean, they should have. And once again, hypocritical. They're like, we set up a government there. We left. We didn't expect the government to fall, but it did. And now we're surprised. Yeah. It's the sort of like, you're hearing it and rationally you're thinking, no, that's not going to happen. But then in practice, it sort of turns out differently.
Biden says he didn't expect it to happen, and every military general in the world.
I was about to say that, right? I mean, that's the big question with this, right? Is it something they didn't expect, or they were expecting it and just didn't care, basically, that was going to happen, right? Which is the less charitable view on the situation. I mean, I still remember this. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, but still, I have my best friend works for the German mission to NATO in Brussels. And he was like, on the day when they announced that withdrawal, people at NATO were running around like chickens with their heads cut off because they were like, this was not what we agreed on, basically. What the hell are they doing? Didn't consult any allies, obviously, just basically went ahead with it. And I think that was the first time when a lot of foreign policy wonks were kind of rethinking their assessment of Biden already, this relatively early into his tenure, right? I mean, the thing that always gets me about the situation in Afghanistan is how preventable it was and how relatively cheap it would have been to keep the situation at the very least at the point where it was before we invited the Taliban to this whole thing. I mean, if I had to take a temperature from the audience here, how many NATO troops you think were in Afghanistan when they announced the withdrawal?
This is a great question.
How many NATO troops? Give me like a ballpark figure, okay? Really rough. Okay, we have 5,000. Anyone with more? 3,000, okay. 10. Okay, so we have pretty good numbers. So it's 2,500. That's it, right? 2,500. So props to everyone who 3,000 has it, right? But so 2,500. So think about this. 2,500 people is easily how much you can fit into one block of barracks somewhere. Okay, that's really not a lot, and that was the only thing seemingly that kept Afghanistan stable enough to keep the Taliban at least away from Kabul. So then the question becomes, is that then the best idea that you have? Like, you have to take these guys out. And also, by the way, before the withdrawal, the US hadn't suffered a single battle casualty in Afghanistan for, I think, 2.5 years or something. Like, it wasn't a bloody war. It was at that point essentially like a peace-building mission, more or less. Because that's what it at least that's how it shook out to be. And then to basically throw that away, I think, was a catastrophic mistake in my mind, a geopolitical mistake. I mean, I get why you might want to do it. You might want to be the president that brings the boys home, right? Yeah. Or the gals. But just from the view of anything but that, it's a catastrophic mistake. That I have no idea. I was flabbergasted.
I can't remember what news organization it was, but they went to the streets in the United States and they were going, how many troops do you think there is? 50,000, 100,000 it was. Yeah. And then they go 2,500, they go, no, you're lying.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the same thing happens when you ask, when you ask the average person on the street, how much are you contributing to foreign aid? Or how much do you think your country pays into the UN's budget or something? And you get, billions and billions and billions of dollars, Or I personally probably pay several thousand pounds, a year to these kind of things. And of course, the contributions are minuscule. And in this particular case, the troop contributions were also minuscule. Because mind you, I said NATO troops, right? That's not even 2,500 Americans. There was still plenty of other countries that had a bunch of people there. So from that perspective, just so a purely domestic story, essentially, about him wanting to, I think, that credit for ending that war, right? That his predecessors couldn't end. Whether or not that's a good idea, or if there was even a war to end at this point, I don't think there was one.
So when are we pulling out of
Oh, Jesus.
That's the next thing.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the difference with Iraq is obviously that Iraq has had a longer time and a greater success at building some domestic institutional structures, right? I mean, they've had a relatively well-functioning government in place for a while, and the Iraqi government is also strong enough, for example, to not purely on its own accord, but it was strong enough, for example, to beat back Daesh, right, for quite a while. That was clearly not the case in Afghanistan, right, where we saw that the so-called Afghan army basically fell apart in the span of an afternoon, what it felt like.
Yeah. What you brought up, I think, was interesting in terms of like the exaggerated figures that I think a lot of people have in their minds, and that brings also talking back again about COP26, G20. These are costly things, but I think in a lot of people's minds, it's a lot bigger than you actually think. And I think it, also in terms of the inheritance of the Biden administration, I think there was this narrative of non-interventionalism that was carried over from the Trump administration. And I think individuals in the Trump administration were like, you know, we don't want to pay for anything, we don't want to participate, we don't want to do that. And, you know, from, populist national perspective, that's, a valid point currently in the national political sphere. But at the same time, you sort of see that, well, like, yes, the U.S. pays most into a lot of these institutions because the U.S. has one of the largest economies and its proportions. And I feel like a lot of the times in terms of deconstructing headlines, which is the topic of our podcast, I think that there's a lot of over-exaggeration of like what exactly is our participation in that. And there is a lot more sort of populist calls these days to just sort of like be out. But I think that people don't realize how little is sort of keeping it all in place at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I've already said that figure, right? That the total UN budget, that includes peacekeeping, that includes every single UN organization, from the food program to UNICEF to all of that, is less than what one member state spends on its healthcare system. Right. Okay, that should already tell us, like, it's probably not proportional to what we expect from the UN in terms of, solving the world's problems. The other figure I like to drag up is that every single person that is on the UN payroll, and I forget the figure, but it's something like 24,000 people or something, is less than the police department of New York City. So if we think of the UN as like the global policeman, then clearly you can't do that with the kind of manpower and then budget, on the other hand, of what's essentially like a Luxembourg, more or less, right? I mean, that's just, if we come to it from a political theory kind of, or IR theory kind of perspective, right? I mean, what that tells us maybe is that states never really intended that to be the case, right? They didn't intend for the organization on its own to be able to solve these problems, because it doesn't have the manpower, it doesn't have the resources, it doesn't have the equipment. I mean, I keep telling people that when I go to, if you ever have the chance to go to the UN building in New York City, do it. They have tours, super cool. You can see like, this is a carpet that Sweden sent us in 1973, and now it still hangs on this wall. But the thing that always gets me is how old everything feels. It literally feels like you go into your grandma's house. Like they have on some of the seats, they used to have telephones that were from like the early 1980s when I went there in the mid 2000s. Like it's pretty clear that the organization itself doesn't have a ton of resources at its disposal, right? So that then, from a theoretical perspective, should tell us like, its job is something else. We shouldn't look to the UN itself as an organization to solve these kinds of problems. At least the way it's set up is it gives us a stage, us being the member states, it gives us an arena where we can then negotiate and come to solutions that can tackle these problems. And so it's completely utopian, or it's a bit boneheaded to think like the UN basically can wade into any global issue and solve it. Right? At this point, someone like Jeff Bezos can probably more credibly do this, or could do this, if he wasn't so busy being a villain. And buying he has to go to space, he has to buy a giant-ass yacht. So, he has to do all kinds of things that are really important when you're really rich. But obviously, Jeff Bezos' wealth alone is a multiple of the UN's budget, which is just ridiculous to think about. From both sides, the UN needs more money, but also Bezos needs less money desperately. That shows you kind of how much we can expect from it, I think, or how much we should expect from it. We should expect from it that it is a good international forum, that it has efficient structures that get states negotiating, and that it has, good leading figures such as the Secretary General, although like they should really make a woman the next Secretary General because it's been like 75 years. So they have leading figures that can frame the debate, right? That can shine a light on important global issues. That's what the UN can do well. What the UN can't do well is keep the peace when no one else wants to keep the peace, or end poverty or end inequality when states give it a pittance basically each year.
But can they stop global warming?
Can they stop global warming? Well, I mean, so now we've come full circle, which is a great thing to do, I think, at the top end of the podcast. I mean, the UN itself, no. Like the member states, maybe not. I wouldn't buy a house on the water, is I guess what I'm saying. I mean,
Florida.
yeah, exactly. Miami, no. Don't buy things in Miami or Mumbai for that matter, or the Maldives or some similar place. All of which are low-lying places that until 2050 might already see the first results of this. I mean, the big question is obviously twofold, right? In this whole thing is A, can you get rich countries to pay their fair share of all of this and take responsibility for things, even though that's A, painful, and B, sometimes, can be uncharitably framed as like some sort of reparations for, our previous sins, right? But then again, just the fact that their previous sins doesn't make them any less ours, right? And then the other side of that coin is, can we get the developing world, or the world that calls themselves developing, but is actually like a really important emitter, like China? Can we get these other important global emitters also like on the same page, or at least get them to make some credible commitments, right? Those are the two things that the UN has to, or that COP sort of has to achieve. And I think for China, interestingly enough, so I'm always a bit of a believer in China. I'm not a China expert, right? So this comes from more like a gut feeling really than deep political analysis, right? But I'm always a little bit of a believer in China because China has shown more sensitivity to some of its domestic concerns than some other autocratic states, okay? Russia, for example, apologies to any people, to any Russians that are listening to this, really doesn't give two shits about most of what affects their population, right? In comparison to other countries. Now in China, you obviously have no real culture of sort of, civil society movements or pressure groups or lobbying at a grand scale, but they are still sensitive to it, right? I mean, China has closed a number of coal plants in the last couple of years because they were in rich coastal cities where the richer citizens, don't really like when they have smog all day. So they are sensitive to their citizens' concerns, right? The deal that the Chinese Communist Party has with its citizens is, we make everything stable and we make you much more prosperous than you were when you were born. That's the deal. In return, you don't really get to say much in the political system, right? That's the deal. And so, but that means there is a deal between the party and the citizens. So whenever one part of that deal falls short, like say you are a rich Chinese community on the coast, you have a gleaming new city, everything is built in the past sort of 15 years, but then you have constant smog from some old coal plant that's around, that's not going to go down well. And it will exert pressure on like local politicians and eventually the national level. So that was a long wind up. I'm a little bit of a believer in China. They've already shown, they've made some commitments to not fund new coal plants along the Belt and Road Initiative, which they used to. So they paid other countries to build coal plants, which is not a great idea possibly. So they've already stopped that. What we really need, of course, is to China to change domestically, right? They produce something like 50% of the global coal power, or they use up 50% of global coal or something along those lines. So if they're not on board, every other deal is basically just a piece of paper, even if we get the whole Western world on it. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
I mean, that's a brilliant way to come back to what we were talking about at the top, and I think that's probably, as we come up to 40 minutes, a great place to end the podcast. So thank you for joining us today for our first episode of the new season of this academic year, and thank you to our live audience.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you. Well done. Well done.